I'm super excited to be here with Katrina Erickson, an occupational therapist and handwriting expert. Katrina, it is fantastic to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you, Cheryl. I'm so glad to be here with you today.
Sure. So, Katrina, for listeners who may be new to your work, new to you, can you please share a bit about your background and what led you to focus on dysgraphia?
I'd love to. I am an occupational therapist, as Cheryl told you, and I began my career as an OT, really serving the needs of individuals and children in specific that had neurological and developmental needs. And then around 30 years ago, I began to shift my focus. I shifted on over into handwriting. And around that time, I began to run, organize, and get children ready with handwriting with summer handwriting camps. And I did that at the OT clinics that I worked with. And what I noticed during that time, those kind of early years, is I started getting kids signing up for my summer handwriting camps that had really no identified learning disability in the school setting. They were typically sent over by developmental pediatricians and neuropsychologists, but they definitely had some common characteristics. And this was sometimes when we weren't really utilizing that term dysgraphia very much. It was something that was recognized in the medical world and not as much in our school systems. And what I began to notice is that there were some similarities. And so this shift into handwriting and working with students with dysgraphia felt natural to me because dysgraphia is a neurodevelopmental brain-based disorder. And we'll talk more about that. But so that shift really felt, easy and natural for me. But since that time, I have been helping not only students, but also their parents navigate through the process. And educators and specialists in the educational realm, how to develop their plans and provide just the right intervention.
Wow. So, and I happen to know also because we work together that you are also a fantastic facilitator for Learning Without Tears. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. So actually, that scenario I just described to you was my path into providing professional development for Learning Without Tears. I would make quick phone calls into the company back in the days when Jan Olson ran her company out of the basement of her home. And I would say, hey, I need some workbooks. And she asked me one day, because I called her on Saturday mornings, and she would say, what is it that you do and why do you need so many workbooks overnighted? I said, well, I've got a whole new group of students starting with me on Monday. So I've got to get these materials. And that's where I started. And since then, I have provided professional development workshops for our students and to help our teachers develop and know how to deliver systematic and explicit instruction in handwriting, not only for our students with dysgraphia, but for all students.
Well, and I'll tell you, if anyone ever has a chance to go see Katrina in action, she is dynamite. So awesome. So, you mentioned that this term dysgraphia was something at the time that you started was not easily said by educators. We didn't quite use the term. So now all of a sudden, I know it has been something in more recent years as an educator that I've heard. What exactly is dysgraphia?
Dysgraphia is a complex disorder. And it is something that we are hearing much more about. States are moving towards setting up guidelines and standards for special educators and programs for specific learning disabilities. But dysgraphia as a specific learning disability is a brain-based neurodevelopmental learning difference that affects writing. The way a person really communicates their thoughts and their ideas, how they get it out onto pen and paper. So it's really about handwriting. Students with dysgraphia, they know what they want to say, but writing it down can be slow. It can be tiring. It can be frustrating. It can be inconsistent. It can be painful for them to produce. It can be hard for other people to read. But really the basis of dysgraphia is it doesn't reflect their true understanding or their verbal abilities.
Mm.
So it's very complex. It can affect their motor skills, their language processing, their use of their working memory and being able to hang on to information so that they can get it out. So it can look different from one person to another. It's not one student with dysgraphia doesn't look exactly the same as the next, but they have some common characteristics.
Wow. So when I'm thinking about that, I'm just thinking about students that I might have had in the past. I'm like, huh, I wonder that they have dysgraphia, or was it something else? So how does one know that it's dysgraphia?
Right. I think that's the challenge, is to know when is it a lack of instruction or
Mm.
maybe not the right instruction. Something that is always thrown around is like Dys-Teach-ia, right? They didn't get taught correctly. Is it Dys-Teach-ia or is it dysgraphia? Dysgraphia really requires a solid academic and intellectual assessment to see what the students know, what they're able to do. And then also bringing in specialists like myself, OTs and others to come in and look at motor skills, to look at the handwriting, and be able to have those assessments tweeze out. Is this a characteristic of dysgraphia? Do they have the hallmark areas of indication that they have dysgraphia, or is this a student that probably didn't get taught? And I think that's probably the first place to start, is to look at, have they been taught and are they still having difficulties?
Wow, I love that, dysgraphia or Dys-Teach-ia. So that really means that there is this relationship between handwriting development and dysgraphia. Can you describe what that relationship is?
Right. So, the relationship between handwriting and dysgraphia comes in with the fact that dysgraphia, the handwriting impairment, is essentially what makes it dysgraphia.
Mm.
The underlying causes between handwriting difficulties in a student who hasn't had instruction versus a student with dysgraphia is different, because a student with dysgraphia has neurological differences that affect multiple cognitive processes related to writing. So the connection is there because dysgraphia is an impairment of their handwriting, as well as some other language-based and cognitive, abilities. But it is a characteristic of their handwriting. That's what we see. So the relationship is strong between them. And not only do our students that are typically developing need explicit instruction to learn this important life skill and skill that they're going to use in classes and in tests and on assignments, but our students with dysgraphia need it even more.
Wow.
And we can talk more about that. They need more explicit and systematic instruction. It's vital to their success.
But before we talk about that, you know what, Katrina, I like this is very intriguing, because when people who don't really know about it, they think that it's a handwriting problem, and that's it. That perhaps there is something motor related wrong, right? Or in your case, maybe they weren't taught it. What are some other kind of common myths or misconceptions as it relates to dysgraphia that you might want to clear up for our listeners?
Right. So I think this is a perfect thing to kind of start our, discussion on those characteristics that we see with students, is that it is more than just messy handwriting for students with dysgraphia. Our students with dysgraphia can have motor difficulties, but they can also have motor planning issues. So it can be fine motor. It can be in the execution and planning of those movements. It involves their letter formation, but also their spelling. There are orthographic processing and encoding or coding issues that our students will have difficulty with. They'll have difficulty applying those phonics rules into their writing, and their spelling is inconsistent, and they have difficulty with even very commonly spelt words that are easy for them to spell. Not only that, our students can have difficulty organizing their written thoughts. So that working memory, getting their information together, storing onto it, and being able to get it out onto paper. So it can be very complex, but we know that our students with that have dysgraphia They need explicit instruction that
Mhm.
is highly multisensory because we have to capture so many areas of their brain to help them with these brain-based deficits that they are dealing with. We have to help them create those pathways, create those connections within their brain, right? So systematic, explicit, highly multisensory. And we
Mm.
need to pair that along with accommodations. It's more than just handwriting. It's very complex in its nature to help them succeed.
So when we say explicit and systematic, when we say that it needs to be very hands-on and multisensory, what does that look like?
It looks like lots of repetition. It looks like breaking the skills down into individual handwriting skills. Um,
Mm.
if you're teaching letter formation to a student that is typically developing and is not having the struggles that a dysgraphia student will have, you will teach letter formation and roll right into word writing and roll right into sentence writing, and you'll move fluidly through those processes, still following a systematic approach. But for a student with dysgraphia, you need to, I always say you got to slow your roll and you got to
Right.
add in those redundancies and repetitions. We need more of everything. So
Yeah.
think of it as going to your favorite restaurant and you're like, can you add a little bit more of the seasoning? Can you add a little bit, more? Can I add some extra sides? It needs more of everything. They need that to make those connections in their brains where their brains are not automatically doing that.
Sure. And I would imagine some of our listeners are thinking, well, darn, I have a classroom full of students with dysgraphia because they're all struggling to write and maybe having some difficulty learning how to decode. So what would you say to a teacher like that that feels like, wait, maybe every child has this, and what do I
Mhm.
do?
Right. I think that's a good thing for our educators to really be thinking about. How do I distinguish the differences between my students that might just be, having some difficulty or need a little more support versus a student who might need a referral for some potential concerns? So for typical development, we want to look at, are they steadily improving with instruction and guidance? Our students with dysgraphia, they show very little improvement over time, despite
Mm.
the supports and guidance and instruction that they're given. Your students that are typically developing in your classrooms, educators, you'll notice that their errors are going to decrease as you remind them, as you give them visual prompts, as you remind them as they start a writing activity, you give them some verbal reminders. Our students with dysgraphia, you can have all that in front of them, and their errors are going to continually persist regardless of the amount of support that you're giving them. Writing speed in a typically developing student is going to go up over time. Our students with dysgraphia, they pretty much stay flat.
Mm.
They're further behind their students. They're the last to get their stuff in, and it's very painful. It causes exhaustion, and whereas, a typically developing student, their effort is manageable as they go along. Yes, they're going to say, "Oh, I don't want to write," but it might just be an isolated event.
Sure. Wow, that's a really good checklist. It's something that feels doable. Thank you, Katrina, for that. I appreciate that. So when we think about children who have handwriting difficulties or who are really having difficulty expressing themselves, um, you know, really, how does dysgraphia impact their confidence, their social emotional well being?
Dysgraphia students will most likely realize that the efforts that they're putting out to get written work, and if we think about a child's day, they can spend up to anywhere from 60 to 90% of their day on writing activities, right?
Yeah.
Especially in the elementary years, and it even increases as you go into the upper grade levels. They notice that their efforts are not making an impact. So their self-confidence goes down. They may self-talk to themselves and say, "I'm just not good at writing. It's hard. my hand hurts. They know that the graphomotor skills, the motor skills that they need to have to hold that pencil, to form those letters, it is so effortful for them. It's like a full marathon for them to sit down and write. And so they suffer a lot of confidence, a lot of self-talk that's negative. And they can also begin to start to check out of the learning activities because they feel like they're not being successful. But what we need to realize, I think, as educators, but also as parents that are looking at their students potentially having dysgraphia or those that are already identified, our students are capable. They have the knowledge. Yeah. It's not that they don't know or they aren't learning. It's the method in which they're able to share what they know through typical channels of handwriting.
Wow. So that's a real mind shift for us then, thinking about how to support those students. So what kind of instructional practices do you think are most effective when we're supporting students with dysgraphia?
There are a really strong evidence for systematic and explicit handwriting instruction. It takes time, it takes diligence, it takes more of, like I mentioned earlier, adding more, giving more opportunities. But keyboarding and technology, we live in this wonderful age of technology, and giving that to a student is important. Now, as an OT, I can tell you that I have sat and watched many, many students have keyboarding added as an accommodation for them to be able to get their written work out. And if they're not being taught how to keyboard, that is just adding to those motor challenges. And a student who has difficulties with organizing their thoughts or utilizing that working memory, the keyboarding is not going to solve those issues for that student. There are spelling supports that we can add in with technology, which are very helpful. So it is multifaceted. So I would say explicit instruction, building the foundational skills that support handwriting and keyboarding, right? With fine motor, with visual motor. Those things need to be strengthened for our students. Giving them keyboarding. And then one thing that I love is let's give them oral responses. Let's allow them to dictate to someone, let them be the scribe. Or utilize recordings of their, we've got some great apps and things that can be utilized. Use them. There's a lot out there. I'm not going to go putting my stamp on any of them, but there are a lot of different ways that students can present their written work using technology.
I love that because, Katrina, what's interesting about what you're saying is that, number one, what I'm learning is dysgraphia students are still your brilliant students who are just having trouble getting out and onto paper those beautiful thoughts that they have, their ideas, their feelings even, and really allowing children to either keyboard or respond orally is an alternative way that they can do that, while in the background also supporting them in developing some of those written skills and really supporting some of those processing skills as well.
Yes. And I do want to add one more thing that I didn't mention, and that is teaching these students cursive. In my experience, it's one of the best things that we can do for them. It really helps them with the fluidity of their writing. And so I would encourage those of you that have students with dysgraphia to really take a look at maybe putting cursive in the forefront for our students, especially if they're identified with dysgraphia somewhere around second grade, third grade. They're ready for it. They're going to need that continual fine motor and visual motor support with your interventions, but give cursive a try. I found it to be an amazing tool for my students, and they're so excited to learn it, and they love it. So
why cursive? Why is cursive like a real response to or support for students with dysgraphia?
In my experience, and what we know through looking at the process of printing and cursive, is that when you write a word in cursive, you touch the paper once when you start to write the word. You touch, you glide through the movements, and at the end, you pick up to either cross or dot letters, and then you move on to the next word. So it kind of flows the same way that we think and we talk in groups and clusters of letters, versus think about having to write the word can, right? C-A-N. You touch the pencil or the paper once for the letter C. You touch it once for A. You touch it again when you touch N. You've got 3 pencil lifts. And for a student that struggles with fine motor, with motor planning, and with working memory, like keeping that word in their mind and the letters that they're going to need, that's a lot for them to organize and plan out in their brain and be able to write the word can. Whereas if you write it in cursive, you have one touch to the pencil or to the paper, right? And you can flow through it. So it is a great option for our students.
I'll tell you, you've heard my story about my nephew, Katrina, a lot, and that I think it really changed his academic career because learning cursive allowed him to write a little faster, to feel a little more confident as well. And so I think I didn't realize it was such a help for dysgraphia students, but how amazing. It also gives children another chance, right? So
it does.
Imagine you've had this really poor experience with print and you don't feel successful, and now cursive is another opportunity. So that's great. I love that.
And it does. And it naturally helps with some of the spacing errors that our dysgraphia students have kind of hallmark characteristics for. And what's connected is the word, and what's not is going to be the space. So the next time they pick up their pencil to start a new word, they create a space. Whereas in print, they're constantly picking up for each and every letter. So you'll see spacing issues with students with dysgraphia, where all of their words are kind of crammed together. But the next sentence, they'll have like spaces all over the place. You can't tell what belongs to a word and what is actually a space. It's very inconsistent, and cursive does offer that as a solution for our students.
That's awesome. Do students with dysgraphia, do they need to know print before you start cursive?
That is a question that I've always asked myself. Do they need to know print? They need to be able to recognize print and read it. And that's a big thing that our dysgraphia students have as one of their strengths. They often read on level, if not above level, okay? And I'm saying that for truly dysgraphic students, because you can be dysgraphic, but you can also be dyslexic have dyslexia with dysgraphia. So there can be other coexisting difficulties that a student might have. So I'm talking specifically just about dysgraphic students. As long as they're reading and they've got print, they don't have to master the art of printing letters before they start to learn cursive. And I've seen it successfully done in some younger students. It does take very systematic and explicit instruction to help these students that are younger with the supports that they need, but they don't ever have to master print before they move on. But I would want them to be able to read it. So I'm not advocating for pre-K students or young kindergartners to start with cursive, but there have been very good success stories with kindergartners learning cursive.
Wow, that's fantastic. So essentially, you still need to know, learn the letters, right? Mm-hmm. So that the letters again match up to those sounds and so forth. So that's important to know. Now, you mentioned something about multisensory being important. How can multisensory approaches to handwriting and writing really support students who struggle, who have those fine motor control issues or who have issues with written expression? How do they support?
Right. So, multisensory is such an important strategy for our students with dysgraphia. Providing those multisensory strategies are really my favorite part of what I do to structure and develop programs for students. Multisensory strengthens the connections between the brain, the hand, and their working memory. So we think about multisensory as pathways: visual, auditory, tactile, even kinesthetic. These practices, when they're embedded in a child's handwriting interventions, they're going to strengthen those neural connections. That's going to help them to compensate when one or more of the other pathways is weak. And we know that they can be weak for our students with dysgraphia. So when you incorporate things like tracing letters while you're saying the letter name, same thing, tracing with chalk or writing in sand, giving them a strong visual to activate that visual pathway, activate the kinesthetic and the tactile. Even one of my favorite things are, doing interlocked hands or holding an item and doing air writing and large motor movements before moving to small motor movements with the fingers are going to activate more areas of the brain. But interlocking hands or holding something together with your hands while you're doing that, guess what? You're going to activate what we call that corpus callosum in the brain, and you're going to help those connections between both sides of the brain. Both sides of the brain are getting input when bilateral movements are done. So when we think about multisensory for our students with dysgraphia, it's really about giving them the opportunity to receive that same information through multiple channels, which is going to make it more likely that that's going to help them keep those patterns more automatic. It's going to reduce their cognitive overload, and it's going to strengthen those connections in the brain, making it easier for them to retrieve. So if one area is weak, they've got multiple other areas in which they have tracked that information to other areas of the brain so that they can grab it when they need it.
Wow, that's really powerful. Thank you. And I could see, thank you for sharing like exactly
my hands.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. For those of you who are listening, if you want to see on YouTube, she's actually showing you which parts of the brain. So she's using her hands to show us as well. So when we think about children who have dysgraphia, what role does practice play? And how do we ensure that practicing feels supportive rather than really overwhelming for a child?
Practice for a student with dysgraphia needs to be carefully done because, as we've discussed, they can become quickly overwhelmed by a writing activity because they already know, they recognize their difficulties, and it's very difficult for them to do the writing activity. So the role in practice is to keep the practice short. And in my experience, load it up with multisensory. The actual paper and pencil practice, that's what needs to be short. It needs to be functional. And I always like to find a connection with my students. Do they like humor? Do they have a favorite interest? And I will gear their writing practice around something they're interested in because I want to make it fun. I also want to make it memorable. But more than that, I want to pull them into the practice and not be something that they dread. So the practice is so important, but keep it short, keep it memorable, keep it fun, and tie it into their interest.
I love that. So as I'm thinking, I always try to put my teacher hat on, and I want to say, imagine that I'm that teacher again who suspects that there might be some students, now that I know what dysgraphia is and know what to look for, that I suspect there are a few students who might need to be referred, or at least we need to know more information about to see how to better support that student. And then, but then I've just got students all over the place, again, that need support. How can I work with students from a multisensory perspective when so many need so much? So like, how can I manage my class?
Right. I think the best way to approach that is to start your handwriting lessons with a multisensory. And that's going to work for, 80% of your class. Start with some type of a multisensory warm-up, whether it's an air writing activity. And you could, for all of your students in your class, use that interlocking hand with both hands doing a bilateral air writing activity for your students. And that's going to help your students in your class, but it's also going to get your students that are having difficulty, right? And that's going to be, anywhere from about 2 to 3 minutes as a warm up to your handwriting lesson. For all students, we want to make sure that we're giving good visuals, right? We want to capture their visual pathways in their brain to really get to that visual cortex and create memorable experiences for them. So you want to model, right? You want to model and show them how to do the skill that you're going to be teaching to them in handwriting. What is going to be your focus? Is it going to be on letter formation? Make sure everybody can see, and amp it up if you need to, add color, add some flair to it, add sound, add voices, really get that auditory pathway. And then if you're teaching sentence spacing, if you're teaching placement of letters, you specifically want everyone to be able to see that. And then do that short practice, right? Everybody needs to put what they just learned from you into practice, and be sure to teach them. And this goes for you dysgraphia students. They need to know how to go back and check their own work. Self-checking is empowering. It teaches them the characteristics of their writing that they need to look for. What are the characteristics and habits of handwriters? And what do I need to go back and look at so I can self-correct, or I can say, oh, that's okay, I'm going to move on. So I think those are the elements that any teacher needs to know. And then for our specialists that then come in and take our students, for specialized instruction, just dial that stuff up, really add more.
Wow. That, self-regulation and really thinking about being more metacognitive is important, I think, for any learner to go back and check. So of course, for our dysgraphia, that's a really great piece of advice.